We need to discuss the trust, Cordelia. It is time you shared it fairly. My mother Victoria stirred her iced tea. The spoon hitting the glass sounded like a gavel. We were sitting in a private suite at the country club 2 days before my wedding. My father Richard slid a stack of authorization papers across the mahogany table. He did not look at me like a father looking at a bride. He looked at me like a CEO looking at an acquisition. At the end of the table, their nervous accountant, Mr. Sterling, hovered over his laptop, waiting for my signature to release the funds. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I looked at the accountant and asked him to pull up the live balance of the legacy accounts before I signed a single page. Richard scoffed. He nodded at Sterling to humor me. The accountant refreshed the portal. He frowned. He refreshed it again. Then he turned the screen toward my parents. The balance across every account read exactly 0. Welcome back to Still Drama Stories, where we sit with the quiet women who stopped shrinking to fit tables they were never offered. If a family has ever treated your future like a joint bank account, they had the right to drain you are in the right place. Tell me your age in the comments and hit subscribe, because the moment my parents realized they were broke is coming, and it is worth the wait. My name is Cordelia Beaumont. I am 28 years old, and I live in Northern Virginia. This part of the state runs on a very specific kind of air. Half of it is Old South prestige country clubs and last names that open doors. The other half is the relentless strategic grid of elite consulting firms sitting just outside the capital. You survive here by understanding leverage. For the last 5 years, I have worked as a management analyst. My job is to walk into failing corporations, identify operational risks, and quarantine the liabilities before they bring the whole structure down. My parents always assumed my work was just paperwork. They underestimated the fact that auditing a liability changes the way you look at a room. I met Liam at a public library fundraiser. He teaches high school history. He wears boots that have seen actual mud, and he cares about the substance of a person rather than the monogram on their sweater. When he proposed, he offered me a quiet life built on solid ground. That was the one thing the Beaumont family could not tolerate. My parents operate on optics. Victoria curates our family image like she is managing a political campaign. Richard talks loudly about generational wealth at charity galas. Growing up, I was the quiet daughter, the compliant one who kept her head down and her grades up, the girl who learned early that Victoria stirred her sweet tea exactly 3 times before she made a demand disguised as a favor. I thought keeping the peace meant keeping my family. I did not realize I was just keeping their books balanced. When you grow up inside an illusion, you learn to spot the cracks in the paint. The cracks in the Beaumont legacy began showing the moment Liam gave me a ring. It was a simple band without a diamond the size of a golf ball. Victoria looked at my left hand and sighed like I had brought a stray dog into her pristine living room. She told me a high school teacher could not possibly grasp the complexity of our social obligations. She said I was settling. What she really meant was that Liam was immune to status, and unbribable men are dangerous to people who deal entirely in leverage. I ignored the sigh. I smiled, and I thanked her for her concern. It is a trick you learn in consulting. You give a hostile party the illusion of compliance while you map their exits. I just never expected I would have to map the exits on my own blood relatives. My grandfather, William Beaumont, built a shipping logistics empire from the dirt up. He was a man who understood load-bearing walls and stress tests. He also understood his son. My father, Richard, spent his 20s treating that empire like a personal till. Grandfather watched Richard fund country club memberships and speculative real estate ventures that consistently collapsed. Before he died, my grandfather sat me down in his study. I was 14, wearing muddy soccer cleats. He handed me a glass of lemonade and told me that wealth in the wrong hands is just a fast car heading toward a cliff. He restructured his estate that very month. He bypassed his only son entirely. The Beaumont family trust skipped a generation, leaving the core assets locked in a fortress of legal clauses, waiting for my 28th birthday. He picked 28 because he believed a person needs to survive their own youth before they can manage real capital. By a twist of calendar math, I was turning 28 exactly 4 days before my wedding to Liam. My parents treated the upcoming date like a corporate holiday. They talked about the distribution as if it were a family dividend. I let them talk. An analyst learns early that correcting a delusion is a waste of energy. You just secure the perimeter. The perimeter in my family was constantly breached by my older sister, Savannah. At 30, Savannah was the undisputed golden child. She lived in a historic Alexandria townhouse with exposed brick and a mortgage my parents quietly paid. Savannah did not have a job. She had a brand. She curated an aesthetic of effortless Southern luxury, posting photographs of equestrian events and yacht club brunches. Her life was an expensive performance, and my parents were the sole producers. Savannah possessed a unique talent for turning any room into a stage for her own anxiety. If she chipped a nail, the entire household had to stop and mourn the manicure. I was the opposite. I solved problems in the dark. During my bridal fitting in Georgetown, Savannah managed to make my dress selection entirely about her upcoming trip to Milan. She sat on a velvet sofa, sipping sparkling water, and complaining that the lighting in the boutique was giving her a migraine. Victoria hovered over her, offering a cold compress, while the tailor pinned my hem in silence. It was a perfect snapshot of our dynamic. I handled the pins. Savannah required the compress. The issue was that Savannah's lifestyle cost more than digital hearts could cover. Her credit cards were always maxed out on designer bags and artisan dog food. Whenever the debt collectors called, she wept to our mother, and Victoria simply opened Richard's checkbook. But lately, the checkbook seemed to be snapping shut a little faster. The cracks started showing during a lunch at a bistro overlooking the Potomac. Victoria invited me under the pretense of finalizing the floral arrangements. We had barely ordered salads before she folded her menu and lowered her voice into a register reserved for church gossip. She stirred her tea 3 times. The ice clinked against the glass. I braced myself. She said Savannah was going through a delicate transition and needed support. The townhouse needed a new roof. Her boutique credit lines were strained. Victoria looked at me with a soft, pleading expression and suggested that since my birthday was approaching, it would be a beautiful gesture of sisterhood if I released a portion of the trust to help Savannah out. She framed it not as a request, but as a sacred duty. "We take care of our own, Cordelia," she whispered. "That is what this family does. Blood honors blood." She reached across the table and patted my hand. She said we could just draft a quick release form making a fraction of the capital liquid before the wedding. She used words like bridge loan and family solidarity. I sat there chewing a piece of lettuce and evaluating the data. A glaring discrepancy stared back at me. The Beaumonts were supposed to be pillars of Northern Virginia wealth. Richard drove a new imported sedan every 2 years. Victoria wore custom jewelry. If they were truly swimming in generational capital, a roof repair in Alexandria should have been petty cash. Why were they begging a daughter they barely tolerated to crack open a walled-off trust fund just to fund a vacation and a few credit cards? It defied logic. Rich people do not panic over boutique debts. Desperate people panic over boutique debts. I realized right then that the opulent wedding they were demanding for me was not a celebration. It was a distraction. They needed me compliant, busy, and blind. Financial abuse is rarely a sudden robbery. It is usually a slow guilt trip disguised as loyalty. They raise you to believe that holding your boundaries is an act of treason. I smiled at my mother across the table. I told her I would speak to the lawyers about what was possible. I gave her the nod she wanted to see. The relief that washed over her face was immediate and terrifying. She ordered a second glass of white wine and started talking about peonies. When I drove back to Liam that evening, I found him grading history essays at our kitchen island. He looked up and saw the tension carrying in my shoulders. I explained the bistro lunch. I explained the clinking ice and the bridge loan pitch. Liam set his red pen down. He did not come from money. He came from a family of nurses and mechanics, people who understood that a dollar earned is a dollar saved. He looked at me with steady, quiet eyes and asked why parents who live in a gated community need their youngest daughter to bail out their oldest daughter. I told him it was the question I could not stop asking. We sat there in our modest apartment analyzing the variables. Savannah's manufactured crises were escalating. The week before, she had called me weeping because her purebred spaniel needed emergency dental work, and she casually wondered if I had an emergency fund she could tap into. I had declined, citing wedding costs. Her tears had vanished instantly, replaced by a sharp, brittle accusation that I was being selfish. The pivot from helpless victim to vicious critic happened in a heartbeat. It was a practiced maneuver. She had been trained by Victoria to weaponize her vulnerability. I realized the upcoming wedding was acting as a deadline for them. The trust would vest. The money would become mine. But if I married Liam, a man who read fine print and asked logical questions, they would lose their grip on me forever. They needed to secure a pipeline to that capital before I said my vows. They needed me to sign a document while I was distracted by seating charts and fabrics. A management analyst knows that when the pressure increases artificially, a system is about to fail. You do not rush a signature unless the alternative is a collapse. I kissed Liam on the forehead and went into my home office. I pulled up the digitized copies of Grandfather William's trust that I kept on a secure drive. I read the clauses. The language was ironclad. The capital was protected until the clock struck midnight on my birthday. I just needed to survive the next 2 months without putting my pen on a single piece of paper they handed me. I thought my strategy was flawless. I would smile, I would deflect, and I would let the calendar do the work. I assumed their desperation was contained to Savannah's townhouse and my mother's country club dues. I was wrong about the scale of the rot. The proof arrived on a rainy Thursday morning through a channel no one thought to monitor. Richard fancied himself a master of finance, but he possessed the technological literacy of a brick. He handled his affairs through a chaotic series of poorly labeled email threads. I was sitting at my desk drinking black coffee and reviewing a risk matrix for a client when my personal inbox chimed. A message from my father popped up on the screen. He had meant to send it to his broker. Instead, his finger had slipped on the autofill, hitting my contact name right below the broker's name in his address book. The subject line read, "Urgent Portfolio Liquidation." I froze. I clicked the attached document. The screen loaded a spreadsheet that made the breath catch in my throat. It was not a request to fix a roof. It was a map of a burning building. The subject line of the email read, "Urgent Portfolio Liquidation Options." It sat at the top of my inbox like a live wire. My father Richard possessed the unearned confidence of a man who had never faced a consequence he could not charm his way out of. But he typed with 2 index fingers and routinely misunderstood how digital address books functioned. He had intended to send this message to his wealth manager, a man named Davis, whose email address started with the same 3 letters as my own. Instead, the message landed on the screen of the one person in the family who knew how to read a balance sheet without letting emotion cloud the math. I did not close the window. I did not delete the message out of a misplaced sense of privacy. When a system is presenting you with raw data, you do not look away. You examine the inputs. I clicked the attachment. A spreadsheet opened, filling my monitor with rows of figures highlighted in glaring red font. My training as a management analyst kicked in instantly. I stopped being Cordelia, the youngest daughter, and became Cordelia, the auditor. I traced the columns, tracking the flow of capital, tracking the liabilities, and tracking the sheer scale of the deception my parents had been running for the better part of a decade. The first tab detailed the primary residence. The sprawling estate in Great Falls with its white columns and manicured boxwoods was the physical anchor of the Beaumont family brand. Victoria hosted charity galas on that lawn. Richard smoked expensive cigars on that patio while dispensing unsolicited financial advice to his neighbors. The spreadsheet exposed the reality behind the brickwork. The house was leveraged to the hilt. There was a primary mortgage that had been repeatedly refinanced. Beneath that sat a second mortgage, and beneath that, a home equity line of credit that was drawn right to the edge of its maximum limit. The interest rates attached to these loans were predatory. My father had been borrowing against the walls of his own home just to pay the landscaping crews and maintain his country club dues. The house was not an asset. It was a sinking ship taking on water faster than they could bail it out. I clicked to the second tab. This one outlined Richard Beaumont Consulting. My father made his living advising mid-size corporations on market synergy and structural efficiency. He sold the illusion of competence. The ledger told a very different story. The firm was bleeding capital. Accounts payable dwarfed accounts receivable by an alarming margin. Payroll was barely being met through a chaotic shell game of transferring funds from personal credit lines back into the business accounts. The company was a hollow facade, propped up by the fumes of a reputation that had expired years ago. Richard was not a titan of industry. He was a man drowning in a tailored suit, hoping nobody noticed the water rising above his chin. I hit print. The machine in the corner of my office hummed and spit out 12 pages of undeniable proof. I gathered the warm sheets of paper and spread them across my desk. I opened my drawer and took out a yellow highlighter. The cap popped off with a sharp plastic click. I dragged the felt tip across the most damning figures: the balloon payments due, the maxed out credit limits, the negative cash flows. The squeak of the marker against the paper was the only sound in the room. I felt no urge to cry. The betrayal was too vast for tears. Tears are for misunderstandings. This was a calculated structural failure. Sitting there in the quiet glow of my desk lamp, the scattered puzzle pieces of the last 6 months suddenly snapped together into a terrifyingly clear picture. The timeline of my upcoming wedding was not a coincidence. It was a deadline. For weeks, Victoria had been escalating her demands for the ceremony. Liam and I had planned a modest, elegant evening in a historic botanical garden. We wanted string lights, good food, and our closest friends. Victoria had treated our plan like a personal insult. She had hijacked the vendor meetings. She insisted on booking the Piedmont Club, a venue known for its exorbitant minimums. She demanded orchids flown in from overseas, a 12-piece brass band, and a raw bar featuring imported seafood. She had expanded the guest list to 300 people, padding it with local politicians, real estate developers, and socialites she barely knew. I had spent weeks fighting her on these upgrades, assuming she was just being a controlling mother obsessed with aesthetics. Looking at the yellow highlights on my desk, I finally understood the true motive. You do not invite the Northern Virginia elite to a modest garden party when you are secretly on the verge of bankruptcy. You throw a gala. You blind your peers with champagne and caviar so they do not notice the repossession notices slipping under your door. Victoria needed the wedding to be an opulent spectacle to project solvency to her creditors and her social circle. She was staging a lavish production to prove the Beaumont empire was still thriving. But galas require deposits. The caterers, the florists, the venue all demanded final payment before the event took place. I looked at the calendar on my wall. Victoria had scheduled the final invoice due dates for the exact week of my 28th birthday. The exact week my grandfather William designed his trust to vest and distribute the capital into my name. The elegance of their trap was breathtaking. They were not planning a wedding to celebrate my marriage to Liam. They were executing a heist. They intended to hand me a stack of 6-figure invoices the moment the trust funds cleared, knowing that a bride days away from walking down the aisle would be too stressed, too distracted, and too desperate to keep the peace to refuse them. They expected me to sign over my grandfather's legacy to pay for a party I never wanted, thereby saving them from public ruin. And once the accounts were open, they would guilt me into covering the second mortgage, the consulting firm debts, and Savannah's curated lifestyle. They viewed my inheritance as a corporate bailout. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The illusion of my family dissolved completely. I had spent my entire life trying to earn my seat at their table, trying to be the easy, compliant daughter who required nothing and offered everything. I thought familial love was a baseline, a given. Holding the printed spreadsheet, I realized familial love in the Beaumont household was merely a ledger. I was not a daughter. I was a liquid asset. A cold, clean focus settled over my nervous system. If my parents had approached me honestly and confessed their ruin, I might have helped them. I might have found a sensible, structured way to clear their debts without compromising my own future. But they had chosen deception. They had chosen to ambush me. They had banked on my submissiveness. They assumed the quiet girl who always nodded and smiled would just hand over the keys to the vault. I capped the yellow highlighter. I gathered the 12 pages and locked them inside my filing cabinet. Passive resistance was no longer a viable strategy. Waiting out the clock would not save me. A management analyst knows that when a hostile entity is targeting your resources, you do not negotiate. You remove the resources from the board entirely. Savannah's manufactured crises and Victoria's floral arrangements were just the visible smoke. The fire was underground, and it was racing toward my future. I needed a counteroffensive. I needed a strategy so silent and so final that by the time they realized they had lost the game, the board would already be packed away. I turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark, deciding exactly how to dismantle the trap they had built for me. There is a fundamental rule in corporate risk management. When you uncover an executive siphoning company funds, you never schedule a meeting to demand an explanation. Confrontation provides the liability and opportunity to hide the evidence or shift the blame. You secure the servers. You freeze the access. You build an undeniable paper trail, and you only reveal your hand when the snare has already sprung shut. I woke up the morning after reading my father's spreadsheet and applied that exact corporate protocol to my own flesh and blood. I want to tell you a secret about negotiation that most people learn the hard way. The greatest weapon you will ever possess is your silence. The urge to yell is natural. I wanted to print that ledger drive to Great Falls and slam the pages onto Victoria's pristine marble kitchen island. I wanted to watch the color drain from Richard's face as I demanded to know why they were pricing my future to cover their failures. But yelling is a trap. Raising your voice tells your opponent exactly what you know and exactly how much it hurts. It gives them the baseline they need to manipulate you back into submission. I chose not to give my family a baseline. I chose to let them operate under the fatal assumption that I was still the blind, compliant daughter they had molded me to be. I spent the next 3 weeks operating like a ghost inside my own daily routine. On the surface, I remained the dutiful bride in waiting. I answered Victoria's endless phone calls about seating charts and signature cocktails. I nodded thoughtfully when she insisted we upgrade the floral arrangements to imported orchids. I gave them no reason to suspect the floorboards were rotting beneath their feet. But in the quiet margins of those weeks, I became an apex predator hunting through public databases. I used my analyst credentials to pull the county property records for the Great Falls estate. The filings confirmed every grim detail on the spreadsheet. The second mortgage was registered to a predatory lender notorious for seizing luxury properties. I pulled the corporate registry for Richard Beaumont Consulting and found 3 separate tax liens filed by the state of Virginia for unpaid payroll taxes. My father was not just borrowing money, he was actively stealing from the state to maintain his country club facade. The final piece of this puzzle required a trip to my bank. I sat in a sterile beige cubicle and retrieved the certified original copy of my grandfather's trust from my safe deposit box. I needed to memorize the exact language of the vesting clauses. As I pulled the thick stapled document from its manila envelope, a smaller piece of heavy cardstock slipped loose and fluttered onto the table. It was a handwritten note from William Beaumont. I recognized his sharp slanted cursive instantly. The paper smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old cedar, the scents that used to cling to his study. The note contained 5 words. Protect what you build, Cordelia. I sat in that quiet room and stared at the ink. My grandfather had bypassed his only son to leave his legacy to a 14-year-old girl. I had always assumed he did it because he believed in my potential. Holding that heavy cardstock, I finally understood the darker truth. He did it because he knew exactly what kind of man Richard was. William Beaumont knew his son was a parasite. The trust was not just an inheritance. It was a shield designed to protect me from the very people who were supposed to raise me. My grandfather had handed me the armor. It was my responsibility to put it on. The illusion of my compliance received its ultimate test the following Sunday. Victoria had summoned me to the Great Falls estate for what she called a bridal brunch. When I arrived, the atmosphere was tense. Savannah was pacing the length of the sunroom, clutching a crystal tumbler of sparkling water and weeping theatrical tears. Her mascara was pristine, which always meant the crisis was financial rather than emotional. Savannah had managed to default on the lease of her luxury imported SUV, and the dealership had threatened to repossess the vehicle from the driveway of her Alexandria townhouse. The sheer panic in her voice was not about losing her transportation. It was about the social humiliation of her neighbors watching a tow truck haul away her curated image. Richard was rubbing his temples, trying to calculate a way to shift funds from a dry well. Victoria hovered, offering Savannah empty platters of comfort. Then Victoria turned her gaze toward me. Her eyes were bright and calculating. She set her hand on my shoulder and delivered the pitch. She sighed heavily, acting as if the burden of wealth was simply too much for one family to bear. She said it was such a shame that Savannah was dealing with this stress right before my beautiful wedding. Then she smiled a soft, predatory smile. She suggested that once Liam and I were officially settled and the trust distribution finally cleared, we could smooth all these silly little misunderstandings over. She framed it as a temporary family bridge, a minor reallocation of resources to keep the Beaumont name unblemished. She looked at me, waiting for the reliable youngest daughter to offer her own future as a sacrifice to the altar of Savannah's vanity. I felt a cold wave of disgust wash through my chest. They were already spending my grandfather's money to pay off a leased car. I looked at Savannah, dabbing her dry eyes, and at Victoria, waiting for my submission. I did not blink. I did not frown. I reached out and took my mother's hand. I smiled the warmest, most vacant smile I could muster. I told her not to worry about a thing. I told Savannah that everything was going to be handled perfectly, and that family always protects family. I fed them their own poisonous script right back to them. The visible relief that flooded the sunroom was nauseating. Richard actually chuckled and poured himself a scotch. Victoria kissed my cheek and immediately changed the subject to the raw bar menu for the reception. I had given them exactly what they needed to drop their guard. They felt secure. They felt victorious. I left the estate an hour later. The moment I closed the heavy oak front door behind me, the smile dropped from my face. I walked down the sweeping brick driveway to my car. The Virginia air was thick and humid, but I felt entirely composed. I got into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and turned the engine on. I knew then that waiting out the clock was impossible. If I allowed the trust funds to transfer into my standard legacy accounts on the morning of my 28th birthday, my parents would unleash a barrage of automated drafts and emotional extortion before I even put on my wedding dress. I could not just protect the accounts. I had to obliterate their access to the banking infrastructure entirely. I pulled my phone from my purse. I did not call the family lawyer. I did not call the wealth manager whose email address was one typo away from mine. I opened a browser and searched for a name I had found buried deep in an old regulatory compliance file from my firm. A man known for moving significant volumes of capital quietly and legally without tipping off the local social grid. I dialed the number of an independent fiduciary located 3 hours away in Richmond, far beyond the reach of Victoria's country club spies. A receptionist answered the line. I kept my voice steady and professional. I stated my name and requested an immediate consultation regarding the execution of a blind, irrevocable trust. I hung up the phone and pulled out of the driveway, leaving my parents to plan a royal wedding on a budget of $0. 2 months before I was scheduled to walk down the aisle, the first direct attack arrived wearing the disguise of a dinner invitation. My mother framed the evening as an intimate gathering to celebrate our upcoming union. She booked a private dining alcove at the Piedmont Country Club, a venue steeped in old money and exclusionary policies. The mahogany-paneled walls and dim lighting were designed to make outsiders feel small. Liam wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit him perfectly, but he tugged at his collar while we waited for the valet. He preferred the quiet hum of a public library over the suffocating scent of roasted duck and expensive perfume. I held his arm, squeezing gently. We walked into the lion den together. Richard and Victoria were already seated at a round table near the hearth. My father swirled a glass of bourbon. My mother wore pearls and a practiced smile. The waiters brought out our salads and filled our water glasses, moving with the stiff, silent efficiency required by the club members. For the first 20 minutes, the conversation hovered over safe, trivial topics. Victoria complained about the seasonal humidity. Richard boasted about a golf tournament he had recently sponsored. They played their parts flawlessly, acting like benevolent aristocrats, preparing to welcome a new son. The performance dropped the moment the dinner plates were cleared. Richard reached down into his leather briefcase and produced a thick stack of ivory paper bound by a heavy brass clip. He set the document onto the white tablecloth and slid it toward the center. The brass clip made a dull thud against the wood underneath the fabric. My father leaned back in his chair, adopting the posture of a wise mentor imparting crucial knowledge. He cleared his throat and delivered the script. He explained that prominent families in our social circle always took precautions before nuptials. He used phrases like historical preservation and generational security. He called the document a standard prenuptial agreement designed merely to protect the Beaumont legacy from unforeseen complications. Victoria chimed in, adding that true love does not require financial entanglement, and that signing the paperwork was a cherished tradition among the Virginia elite. They painted the contract as a badge of honor, a simple rite of passage required to enter their world. Liam did not flinch. He looked at the thick stack of paper, and then looked at my father. He stated calmly that he had no interest in my inheritance and would happily sign a standard waiver separating our assets. My mother offered a patronizing chuckle. She patted her lips with a linen napkin and turned her gaze toward Liam. Her eyes were devoid of warmth. She spoke to him using the tone one might use to scold a confused child. She suggested that a high school teacher, unaccustomed to the nuances of wealth management, could not possibly grasp the gravity of the situation. She implied his background left him ill-equipped to handle the complexities of our social sphere. Her words were dipped in honey, but tipped in poison. Victoria wanted to isolate Liam to make him feel inadequate and unworthy of the table he was sitting at. She hoped to trigger his pride, sparking an argument that would distract me from the actual pages sitting between us. My fiancé grew up in a household where respect was earned through honest labor, not inherited through a trust fund. His father repaired engines. His mother worked long shifts at a county hospital. Liam knew exactly what real value looked like, and he knew it was absent from this dining room. He did not take the bait. He reached for his water glass, took a slow sip, and met Victoria's stare. He told her she was correct about his lack of interest in high society maneuvering. He reaffirmed that his commitment was to me, not my bank account. He diffused her insult by refusing to defend his worth to someone incapable of recognizing it. While my mother attempted to rattle Liam, my hands moved toward the ivory paper. I did not just skim the cover page. I flipped the heavy document open and began to read the fine print. My training as a management analyst involves hunting for the buried clauses, the quiet provisions that shift liability from one party to another. I read contracts the way mechanics inspect an engine block, searching for the deliberate flaw. The first few pages contained standard boilerplate language separating premarital property. It was the camouflage. On page 11, buried under a dense thicket of legal jargon regarding future estate allocations, I found the Trojan horse. It was labeled Article 4, subsection C. The clause did not just protect the Beaumont family trust from Liam. It actively rewired the control structure of my own inheritance. The provision required the establishment of a joint advisory portfolio upon the finalization of the marriage. It mandated that the bride place all vested trust assets into this new vehicle. The very next sentence named the designated senior family advisor, who would possess co-management authority over all subsequent investments and withdrawals. The name typed in crisp black ink was Richard Beaumont. The sheer audacity of the scheme made my pulse drop into a slow, steady rhythm. They were not trying to protect me from my future husband. They were using the marriage as a legal crowbar to break into the vault my grandfather had locked them out of. If I signed this document, I would willingly hand my father the keys to the kingdom. He would gain the authority to funnel my trust into his failing consulting firm, to pay off the predatory second mortgage on their estate, and to finance Savannah endless luxury vacations. They had gift-wrapped a financial coup and called it a Southern tradition. Richard leaned forward, tapping the tablecloth with his index finger. He produced a silver pen from his jacket pocket and offered it to me. He urged me to initial the highlighted section so we could return to celebrating. He promised the paperwork would be filed quietly, keeping our family business secure. He smiled, waiting for the compliant youngest daughter to obey. I looked at the silver pen. I looked at the ivory pages outlining the theft of my future. I did not scream. I did not hurl the document across the table or accuse them of betrayal. An analyst never reveals the extent of their knowledge until the opposing side has exhausted their leverage. I took the document, gathered the edges to ensure the pages were perfectly aligned, and folded the thick stack in half. I unclasped my leather tote bag and slid the contract inside, hiding it from view. The air in the private dining alcove grew instantly heavy. Richard's hand remained suspended over the table, the silver pen pointing at empty space. Victoria's smile froze her eyes, darting from my tote bag back to my face. I spoke in a voice devoid of emotion. I told them I appreciated their diligence in preserving the family legacy. I explained that because the document involved complex estate restructuring prudence, required a thorough independent review. I stated I would be sending the contract to my own fiduciary counsel in Richmond for a comprehensive audit before providing any signatures. The silence that followed was profound. My parents exchanged a rapid, panicked glance. It was a micro-expression lasting only a fraction of a second, but it contained volumes. They had expected a naive girl blinded by wedding planning and eager to please. They had encountered an auditor requesting external validation. The panic in their eyes stemmed from the realization that their easy mark was reading the fine print. Richard attempted to recover his composure. He cleared his throat and stammered that outside lawyers often complicated simple family matters. He suggested we keep the review in-house, using their trusted accountant, Mr. Sterling, to answer any questions I might have. I stood up from the table. Liam followed my lead, standing tall beside me, a silent pillar of support. I told my father that Grandfather William always advised securing independent verification for any contract exceeding 5 pages. I offered a polite nod, thanked them for the dinner, and turned toward the exit. We walked out of the country club, leaving my parents sitting in the dim light staring at an empty tablecloth. The trap had failed. The war had officially begun, and they had no idea I was already plotting the final move. The drive to Richmond took 2 hours. I left the sprawling, manicured lawns of Northern Virginia behind and navigated toward a bleak industrial park on the edge of the city. I did not want a lawyer who played golf with my father or attended charity galas with my mother. I needed a predator who operated in the deep water. Elias Thorne came highly recommended by a forensic accountant I once collaborated with on a corporate merger. Elias did not care about the Beaumont family legacy. He cared about ironclad structures and impenetrable legal defense. His office sat behind an unmarked frosted glass door on the 3rd floor of a concrete building. There were no oil paintings or leather-bound volumes. There was only a steel desk, a high-speed scanner, and a man who looked like he had not slept a full night in a decade. Elias wore a wrinkled dress shirt and wire-rimmed glasses. He did not offer me coffee or engage in polite social maneuvering. He simply extended his hand and asked for the documents. I retrieved the manila folder from my tote bag. I handed him the certified copy of my grandfather's original trust, the financial spreadsheets my father had accidentally emailed me, and the fraudulent prenuptial agreement my parents had attempted to force upon me at the country club. I sat in a stiff plastic chair and watched him work. For 45 minutes, the only sound in the office was the rustle of turning pages and the occasional scratch of a black fountain pen. Elias read the contracts with the cold mechanical efficiency of a surgeon examining an X-ray. He cross-referenced the routing numbers on my father's spreadsheet with the disbursement clauses in my grandfather's trust. He traced the lines of liability my parents had carefully hidden. When he finally set his pen down, he took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Elias told me I possessed excellent instincts. He confirmed that the prenuptial agreement was indeed a weapon designed to grant my father permanent control over my capital. But then he revealed a truth that made my blood run cold. The prenuptial agreement was just a backup plan. The primary trap had been set years ago, and the jaws were already primed to snap shut. Elias turned his monitor toward me. He explained the banking architecture my parents had established when I was a minor. The account waiting to receive my trust distribution was a legacy custodial account. My father had set it up under the guise of managing my childhood savings, while my grandfather's trust mandated that the funds must be deposited into an account bearing my name. It did not specify that the account had to be sole and separate. My father had attached a dormant web of routing protocols to this legacy account. Elias pointed to the screen detailing a series of automated sweeps linked directly to Richard Beaumont Consulting and the predatory lender holding the second mortgage on the Great Falls estate. The trap was breathtaking in its silent efficiency. My father did not need me to sign the prenuptial agreement to steal the initial distribution. The moment the clock struck midnight on my 28th birthday, the trust would vest. The capital would drop into the legacy account. Within seconds, the dormant algorithms my father had installed would trigger automatically drafting the funds to cover his payroll taxes and his ballooning mortgage payments. The money would vanish before I even woke up to put on my wedding dress. The prenuptial agreement was simply their method for capturing whatever residual investments remained and ensuring I could never sue them to recover the stolen cash. I felt a physical weight settle onto my chest. My parents were not just desperate. They were methodical. They had spent years wiring my financial foundation with explosives waiting for the precise moment to detonate them. I looked at Elias and asked him how we dismantled the bomb. Elias did not smile, but his eyes sharpened with a distinct professional hunger. He told me we do not dismantle the bomb, we remove the target. He outlined a counteroffensive that was elegant, ruthless, and entirely invisible. We would not fight my parents for control of the legacy account. We would abandon it. Elias proposed establishing a new blind limited liability company registered in a state with strict corporate privacy shields. This company would act as a holding vehicle. We would then construct a fortified, irrevocable trust layered on top of the company, making it nearly impossible for outside entities to pierce the corporate veil. This new structure would become the sole legal recipient of my grandfather's inheritance. The execution relied on timing and secrecy. Elias would submit a formal redirection order to the corporate trustee managing my grandfather's estate. The order would legally mandate that upon my 28th birthday, the entirety of the capital must bypass the compromised legacy account and flow directly into the new blind trust. Because I was the sole named beneficiary, adjusting the receiving destination was well within my rights. My father held no legal standing with the corporate trustee. He would not receive a notification. He would not receive an alert. He would remain blissfully unaware of the redirection until he attempted to access the capital. The beauty of the plan was its frictionless silence. There would be no courtroom battles leading up to the wedding. There would be no screaming matches in the parlor. The wealth would simply reroute itself in the dark. On the morning my father expected to execute his salvation, he would find a hollow shell. Elias began printing the formation documents. The heavy machine hummed, producing stack after stack of crisp, white paper. He spread them across the steel desk and handed me the black fountain pen. He pointed to the signature lines indicating where I needed to authorize the creation of the LLC, the trust, and the redirection orders. I held the pen. The smooth metal felt heavy in my fingers. I was 28 years old, sitting in a bleak industrial park preparing to sever the final tether, binding me to the people who gave me life. Signing these papers meant executing a permanent division. It meant destroying my parents' public standing, their home, and their business. It meant I was officially making myself an orphan by choice. A profound sorrow washed over me, not for the parents I was defeating, but for the parents I never had. I grieved the mother who could have helped me choose flowers without a hidden agenda. I grieved the father who could have walked me down the aisle without calculating my net worth. I mourned the family dinner table that had always been a stage for transactions. I let myself feel the ache of that loss. I let it move through my system, burning away the last lingering traces of guilt. Then the sorrow solidified into an unbreakable resolve. My grandfather had built an empire from the dirt, and he had trusted me to protect it. He knew I possessed the strength to survive the people who sought to exploit us. I lowered the pen to the paper. I signed my name with steady, deliberate strokes. I signed the formation documents. I signed the privacy waivers. I signed the redirection orders. With every stroke of ink, I reclaimed a piece of my own autonomy. The empowerment was heavy and cold, but it was mine. Elias gathered the documents, organizing them into neat, immaculate stacks. He told me the system would be live within 48 hours. The trap was set, and the vault was secured. He advised me to return to my life, to play the part of the distracted bride, and to give my family no reason to look beneath the surface. I thanked him, shook his hand, and walked out of the office. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the concrete parking lot. I got into my car and gripped the steering wheel, feeling the profound silence of the victory I had just secured. The money was safe, my future with Liam was safe, but the game was not over. My mother was an intuitive creature. Victoria possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense when a target was slipping away. If I became too quiet or too agreeable, she would smell the deception. She would probe for weaknesses, and she would aim her sights at the only vulnerability I had left to exploit. I turned the ignition and pointed my car back toward Northern Virginia, knowing the storm was gathering. Victoria could not touch my bank accounts anymore, but she could still attempt to break the man I was going to marry. The burden of maintaining a dual existence requires a staggering amount of energy. I had built a fortress around my assets, but projecting the illusion of compliance was draining my reserves. Victoria possessed the predatory instinct of a hawk. She felt the subtle shift in my posture. I smiled at her vendor meetings. I approved the imported linens and the expensive catering menus. The reliable daughter she relied on appeared to be functioning normally, but the underlying submission was gone, replaced by an auditor merely going through the motions. Since my mother could no longer find a foothold in my defenses, she pivoted her attacks toward the foundation I was building with my fiancé. She targeted Liam. Liam taught history at a public magnet school in Fairfax County. He spent his days discussing the collapse of empires with teenagers. He was grading essays in his empty classroom on a Tuesday afternoon when Victoria appeared in the doorway. She wore a tailored cream blazer and carried a designer handbag that cost more than his monthly salary. She did not knock. She simply stepped into his domain and began her campaign of psychological warfare. She claimed she was in the neighborhood running errands for the bridal shower. It was a transparent lie. Victoria never ventured outside her gated zip code without a calculated agenda. She sat in a hard plastic student desk, crossing her legs and flashing the same vacant smile she used at charity galas. She started by complimenting his dedication to public service, phrasing the praise like a polite insult. Then she tightened the snare. She suggested that marriage to a Beaumont carried heavy social expectations. She murmured that love is beautiful, but resentment grows when a husband cannot provide the standard of living a woman has grown accustomed to. She painted a picture of a future where I would grow tired of budgeting and eventually blame him for holding me back. She handed him a card for a boutique investment firm, implying he needed professional intervention to elevate his meager standing before he embarrassed our family. A lesser man would have grown defensive. A proud man would have raised his voice and argued his worth. Liam did neither. He looked at the thick cardstock and left it resting on the laminate desktop. He told my mother that he and I shared a very clear understanding of what held true value. He politely thanked her for her concern, gathered his graded essays, and informed her he had a staff meeting to attend. He dismissed the matriarch of the Beaumont family with the same gentle firmness he used to redirect a disruptive student. He did not call me in a panic. He did not question our relationship. He simply let her poison evaporate in the fluorescent lighting of a public school corridor. I learned about the visit 3 hours later when I returned to our apartment. Living a double life was wearing me thin. I spent my days analyzing corporate logistics and my evenings pretending to care about the seating arrangements for a wedding that was actually an elaborate financial trap. I carried the weight of my parents' impending ruin and the secret of my own countermeasures. The isolation was a heavy coat. I unlocked our front door, expecting to find Liam grading papers at the kitchen island. Instead, I found him kneeling on the hardwood floor with a screwdriver in his hand. The bottom hinge of our heavy wooden front door had been loose for weeks, causing the frame to stick and scrape against the floorboards. I had placed a maintenance request with the landlord twice to no avail. Liam decided to bypass the bureaucracy. He had purchased a new set of reinforced steel hinges on his way home from work. He was quietly aligning the metal, driving the screws deep into the wood to secure the door. His sleeves were rolled up, exposing the faint trace of chalk dust on his forearms. I dropped my keys on the counter and watched him work. My father, Richard, viewed manual labor as a profound indignity. If a light bulb flickered at the Great Falls estate, Richard would hire a specialized contractor and charge the invoice to a draining credit line. Richard built nothing. He only borrowed against the things other people built. Liam was different. He saw a broken mechanism, and he simply repaired it with his own hands. He did not seek praise. He just wanted the door to function properly and keep the drafts out. Standing in the entryway, watching the man I was going to marry secure our home, I felt the isolated coldness in my chest begin to thaw. Liam finished tightening the final screw. He stood up, wiped his hands on a rag, and looked at me. He recounted Victoria dropping by his classroom. He recited her thinly veiled threats without a trace of insecurity. He asked me what was truly happening behind the facade of the floral arrangements and the caterers. I realized in that moment that keeping him in the dark was a disservice to the partnership we were forging. An analyst protects the data, but a wife trusts her husband. I took his hand and led him into my home office. I unlocked the filing cabinet and pulled out the 12 highlighted pages I had printed from my father's accidental email. I laid out the spreadsheets detailing the second mortgage, the predatory lenders, and the unpaid payroll taxes. I showed him the certified copy of my grandfather's trust and the clauses my parents intended to exploit. I explained the automated sweeps linked to my childhood legacy account. Finally, I showed him the formation documents for the blind limited liability company and the new irrevocable trust Elias Thorne had drafted. I laid out the entire blueprint of my family's deception and my own silent countermeasure. I braced myself for shock. I expected him to be overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the toxicity. I offered him an exit. I told him he did not have to marry into a war zone. I told him he could walk away, and I would not blame him. Liam looked at the paperwork scattered across the desk. He did not flinch. He did not pace the room or raise his voice. He reached across the desk, pulled a fresh legal pad from the stack, and picked up a pen. He asked me what time the transfer was scheduled to execute and what gaps we still needed to monitor before the wedding day. He did not run. He sat down and helped me fortify the perimeter. He reviewed the timelines tracking the dates of the vendor invoices against the vesting schedule of the trust. He brought me a glass of water and rubbed my shoulders while we mapped out the final days leading up to the ceremony. I looked at him, analyzing the data with steady, calm precision. And I understood a fundamental truth. Family is not defined by shared bloodlines or memberships at elite country clubs. Family is not the people who look at your future and see a balance sheet they can plunder. True family consists of the people who hand you a screwdriver when the hinges are loose. It is the people who help you hold the door shut against the wolves. We spent the rest of the evening organizing the files and locking them back in the cabinet. A quiet, profound peace settled over the apartment. We were a united front. The Beaumont Empire was going to collapse, but our foundation was solid. I finally felt a sense of relief wash over my exhausted nerves. Then my cell phone vibrated on the desk. The screen illuminated the dark room. It was a text message from my sister Savannah. It was not a question about bridal fabrics or bachelorette party logistics. It was a frantic, demanding block of text laden with capitalized words and exclamation points. Savannah was declaring an immediate financial emergency, claiming she needed my physical presence at the Great Falls estate by morning. The peace shattered instantly. The final desperate gambit was beginning. The text message from my sister dictated an arrival time of 8 the next morning. 3 weeks remained until the wedding. I drove the familiar route back to Great Falls, watching the morning fog burn off the Potomac River. The heavy iron gates of my parents' estate swung open, revealing a property that felt less like a home and more like a decaying stage set. I parked my car behind my sister-imported SUV. The very same vehicle Victoria had panicked about a few weeks prior sat gleaming in the driveway. Its pristine condition confirmed my suspicion that every crisis in this household was a revolving door of manufactured emergencies. I walked through the front entrance, and the heavy silence of the foyer broadcasted the exact kind of performance being staged in the living room. I found them arranged like actors waiting for the curtain to rise. Savannah sat curled on the center of the cream linen sofa, clutching a silk-embroidered throw pillow to her chest. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her makeup remained flawless. Victoria stood near the grand fireplace, holding a lace handkerchief. Richard paced the perimeter of the Persian rug, jingling the spare change in his pocket. The air in the room was thick with unearned tension. My father stopped pacing the moment I entered. He gestured toward a wingback chair, instructing me to sit. He informed me that the family was facing an unprecedented disaster, and my cooperation was essential to mitigate the damage. Savannah took her cue. She drew a ragged breath and launched into a monologue she had clearly rehearsed. She claimed her Alexandria townhouse was in the final stages of foreclosure. According to her narrative, a sudden shift in the real estate market, combined with an unexpected legal dispute, had frozen her assets. She wept softly, pressing the silk pillow tighter. She stated she needed a cash injection of $150,000 by the end of the week. Without it, she would be evicted. Her curated life would be exposed to her neighbors, and the resulting scandal would humiliate the family name. Victoria stepped forward to support the fiction. She dabbed the corner of her eye with the lace handkerchief. She painted a vivid picture of the local gossip columns tearing their reputation apart. She spoke about the legacy my grandfather built and how a public eviction would shatter their standing in the Virginia social circles. She fixed me with an expression of profound sorrow. She whispered that the timing was unfortunate, but my upcoming trust distribution provided a miraculous solution. She called it a blessing. She claimed my impending wealth was the lifeline they desperately needed to save my sister from public ruin. Richard moved to the mahogany coffee table and produced a manila folder. He slid it toward my chair. Inside lay a drafted agreement for a bridge loan. The terms were simple and lethal. The document authorized a temporary lien against my trust distribution, guaranteeing that the moment my grandfather funds vested $150,000 would instantly route to an account controlled by my father. He framed it as a temporary measure. He promised he would repay the sum within a year once his consulting firm finalized a major government contract. He offered me a silver pen, expecting the reliable youngest daughter to buckle under the weight of her sister shedding tears and her mother feigning shame. I did not reach for the pen. I sat in the wingback chair and let the silence stretch. I looked at Savannah trembling on the sofa. I looked at the bridge loan resting on the table. My pulse remained steady. The management analyst inside me stepped to the forefront, evaluating the pitch, isolating the variables, and searching for verifiable data. When a client claims they are facing bankruptcy, you do not hand them a check. You demand their ledger. I folded my hands in my lap and spoke in a flat, professional tone. I told Savannah I was sorry she was experiencing such severe distress. Then I asked her to provide the foreclosure notices. Savannah blinked. The rhythm of her weeping hitched. I elaborated on my request. I asked to see the certified letters from the bank, the delinquency warnings, and the legal filings detailing the dispute she mentioned. I requested the contact information for her loan servicer so we could verify the exact payoff amount required to halt the eviction process. A bank does not seize a property in silence. The legal mechanism of foreclosure generates a mountain of registered mail and court dockets. If she required $150,000, there would be a paper trail proving the exact sum. Savannah faltered. Her gaze darted toward Victoria, seeking a rescue. She stammered that the documents were locked in a vault or held by a lawyer whose name she could not readily recall. She claimed the situation was moving too rapidly for standard paperwork. Richard intervened, attempting to bully his way past my inquiry. He raised his voice, insisting that family members do not interrogate one another during a crisis. He demanded I trust his assessment of the situation and sign the bridge loan to secure my sister a safety net. I kept my eyes fixed on Savannah. My sister lacked the discipline to maintain a lie under direct scrutiny. She glanced down at her designer handbag, resting near her feet. Tucked into the side pocket, partially visible, was a glossy printed itinerary. The bold lettering caught my attention. It detailed a month-long luxury retreat on the Amalfi Coast, complete with private villa rentals and a retained public relations agency specializing in digital rebranding. The pieces snapped together with cold precision. There was no foreclosure. There was no banking dispute. Savannah was suffocating under the weight of her own failures, and she wanted to purchase an escape hatch. She intended to use my grandfather legacy to fund a European vacation and a manufactured career relaunch, hoping a new aesthetic would erase her mounting irrelevance. I did not expose the brochure. Revealing what I knew would only invite a louder, chaotic argument. I needed to paralyze them with their own reverence for high society protocol. I looked at my father and offered a mild, apologetic smile. I stated that I would love to help my sister navigate this terrible chapter. I gently tapped the bridge loan on the table. I explained that because my trust was entering its final vesting period, my fiduciary council had enacted a strict freeze on all new financial commitments. I told them my accountant required a mandatory review period for any encumbrance exceeding $10,000. I informed my father I simply could not sign a binding financial instrument without my legal team auditing the terms first. The excuse functioned as an impenetrable shield. Richard and Victoria had spent my entire life worshiping the complex bureaucracy of wealth management. They bowed to accountants, lawyers, and financial advisors. By invoking those very figures, I trapped them in a paradox. If they argued against the review, they would admit the bridge loan was fraudulent. If they accepted the review, they knew my supposed legal team would tear their fabricated foreclosure apart. Victoria dropped the lace handkerchief to her side. The theatrical sorrow vanished from her face, replaced by a rigid, simmering fury. She glared at me. Her eyes narrowed, realizing the compliant daughter was hiding behind a wall of red tape she could not breach. Richard snatched the manila folder off the coffee table. He shoved the bridge loan back into his briefcase, the silver pen clattering against the leather. He muttered that I was making a grave error, prioritizing technicalities over my own flesh and blood. Savannah let out a sharp, dramatic sob, burying her face in the silk pillow. The performance had shattered, leaving only the raw, desperate reality of their greed. I stood up from the wingback chair, smoothed my trousers, and told them I would await the foreclosure documentation so my team could begin their review. I turned my back on the living room and walked out the front door. The tension I left behind was a pressurized container on the verge of rupturing. They were running out of time, and I knew their failure today guaranteed their next move would be their most dangerous. The failure of Savannah and her fabricated foreclosure accelerated the timeline. My family realized their window of opportunity was rapidly closing, and their desperation morphed into a frantic, manic energy. They had exactly 4 days left before I walked down the aisle. More importantly, they had only 24 hours before my 28th birthday. Tuesday arrived with a quiet gray dawn spilling over the Virginia suburbs. I woke up in my own apartment next to Liam. He was already awake, dressed for his teaching job, and holding 2 mugs of black coffee. He handed me one and simply wished me a happy birthday. There were no balloons in our kitchen. There was no confetti on the counter. We both knew today was not a celebration. Today was an extraction. My grandfather, William, had selected this specific age for a very deliberate reason. He built his shipping logistics company by outsmarting men who relied on inherited titles rather than earned intelligence. He understood human development better than he understood maritime law. He believed 28 was the exact threshold where a person stopped seeking the approval of their parents and started protecting their own peace. He knew that if he handed me a fortune at 21, my father would have bullied me into surrendering it. He gave me the gift of time. He gave me a decade to witness my parents' financial decay, so I would possess the hardened resolve necessary to guard the vault. I took my coffee into my home office and booted up my encrypted laptop. Elias Thorne had transmitted the secure portal link the night prior. The digital interface was stark white and minimalist. There were no friendly banking logos or customer service chat boxes. It was a sterile digital corridor designed exclusively for high net worth asset protection and corporate restructuring. I entered my complex credentials and authenticated the login through 3 distinct security layers. The dashboard loaded, displaying the legacy custodial account my father had monitored for over a decade. The balance sat there 9 figures deep, resting like a sleeping giant. It was waiting for the automated sweeps Richard had secretly programmed to trigger later that same afternoon. I checked the clock on my wall. The time was exactly 8 in the morning. Elias had structured the legal redirection order to supersede any existing draft protocols my father had hidden in the banking architecture. I moved my cursor over the execution command. I took a slow, deep breath and clicked the button. A thin green loading bar appeared in the center of the monitor. I watched the green line push forward, filling the empty white space. It took precisely 14 seconds. In those 14 seconds, the immense inheritance my grandfather had forged through decades of grueling labor lifted out of the compromised legacy account. It bypassed my father and his hidden funnels and landed smoothly inside the fortified walls of my new blind limited liability company. The screen refreshed. The legacy account balance dropped to 0. The transfer was frictionless and total. No alarms sounded in the system. No emergency notifications pinged my father on his mobile phone. The wealth simply ceased to exist within the realm of the Beaumont family reach. I pressed the print command on my keyboard. The small machine in the corner of my office hummed and delivered the physical confirmation receipts. I opened my desk drawer and removed a single unadorned manila folder. I slid the warm papers inside and sealed the brass clasp. The folder weighed almost nothing, but it contained the gravity of my entire freedom. While I was securing my financial independence, Richard and Victoria were orchestrating their own fictional salvation. Later that afternoon, I was summoned to the Piedmont Country Club for a final bridal luncheon. Victoria had reserved the exclusive covered terrace overlooking the 18th hole. She had invited 12 prominent women from her elite social circle. These were the wives of state senators, real estate moguls, and prominent venture capitalists. They were women who wielded neighborhood gossip like a lethal currency. Victoria wore a lavender silk dress and buzzed with a frantic, manic energy. She was treating my upcoming nuptials like a corporate merger, where she and Richard were the sole beneficiaries. I sat at the end of the long linen-draped table, sipping sparkling water and observing the performance. Victoria held court with a crystal champagne flute in her hand. She spoke loudly, ensuring the neighboring tables could hear her boasts. She detailed the imported orchids, the 12-piece brass band, and the lavish raw bar she had bullied me into accepting for the reception. Then she lowered her voice into a conspiratorial whisper designed to echo across the terrace. She told her influential friends that Liam and I were making a rather generous financial contribution to the family estate as a gesture of profound gratitude for my upbringing. She implied my trust fund was a communal, while she was graciously allowing me to draw from, to honor the Beaumont name. One of the socialites, a woman dripping in excessive diamonds, praised Victoria for raising such a dutiful and loyal daughter. Victoria offered a modest, practiced sigh. She claimed preserving a family legacy required immense sacrifice, and she was simply relieved I finally understood the importance of our social standing. She was painting a masterpiece of financial fiction. She was telling the most powerful women in Northern Virginia that her crippling debts were about to be erased by my compliant generosity. She was banking her entire remaining social capital on a phantom check she believed she could force me to write. I sat there, listening to her weave this elaborate delusion. I felt the smooth edge of the manila folder resting inside my leather tote bag against the leg of my chair. I want to share a critical piece of operational strategy with you. If you ever find yourself sitting across from a narcissist who is building a reality out of sand, you must never interrupt them. You do not correct their timeline. You do not point out the incoming tide. You sit quietly and you let them construct their castle as high as their arrogance will allow. The higher they build the false narrative, the more devastating the collapse will be when the ground inevitably falls away. Victoria continued to pour champagne and boast about her brilliant negotiations with the high-end estate vendors. She had no idea her credit lines were tethered to a hollow shell. She did not realize the legacy account she viewed as her personal rescue fund was currently holding nothing but digital dust. Her entire performance was running on the fumes of an assumption I had already neutralized hours ago. I smiled politely at the senator wife. I thanked the real estate mogul for her warm well wishes. I played the part of the quiet, submissive bride to absolute perfection. The luncheon concluded with a toast to the enduring Beaumont family prosperity. I raised my glass of water and touched it against their crystal flutes. The tension in my chest was a tightly coiled spring. The asset transfer was complete, but the inevitable fallout was still pending. Richard would eventually log into his terminal to initiate his automated sweeps. He would attempt to siphon the capital to pay the caterer, the florist, and his own ballooning predatory mortgage. The friction was coming. The gears of his deception were about to grind against the steel wall I had erected in the dark. I walked out of the country club carrying my tote bag and waited for the trap to spring. I was standing on a circular velvet pedestal in a Georgetown bridal boutique when my phone vibrated inside my leather tote bag. A tailor knelt at my feet, pinning the hem of my gown. The dress was a simple ivory silk design that Victoria had repeatedly called underwhelming and austere. My mother sat across the room on a tufted chaise lounge sipping sparkling water and ignoring the fitting entirely. She was busy typing furiously on her smartphone, a triumphant and predatory smile playing on her lips. I did not know it at that precise second, but the vibration in my bag was the sound of my father attempting to execute the final stage of his theft. Richard Beaumont operated under the fatal assumption that he controlled the flow of time and capital in our family. He had logged into his banking terminal from his dark oak study in Great Falls and initiated the wire transfers. He did not wait for the ink to dry on my marriage license. He did not wait for the reception or even the rehearsal dinner. My father possessed a dangerous combination of financial arrogance and technical ignorance. He assumed that because the trust vesting date coincided with my birthday, he could simply reach into the account and pull the levers. He initiated 3 distinct automated sweeps to funnel capital out of my legacy account. The first wire was meant to pay the opulent caterer for the gala I never wanted. The second was designed to secure a phantom bridge loan for Savannah and her European rebranding tour. The third and largest transfer was routed directly to the state tax authority to cover the delinquent payroll taxes of his failing consulting firm. When a high net worth wire transfer is initiated, the banking system employs a standard clearing protocol. The transaction does not settle instantly. It enters a holding pattern for 48 hours to allow compliance officers to verify the routing algorithms and ensure liquidity. On my father's monitor, the status bar simply displayed a green pending notification. In his mind, the word pending meant victory. He assumed the capital was secured. He sent a text message to Victoria celebrating his success. That was why my mother was smiling in the bridal boutique. She looked up from her screen and told me that my father had finalized the last of the vendor details and that the Beaumont legacy was safe. She praised her husband for his brilliant stewardship of the family resources. She played the part of the relieved matriarch, perfectly looking at me with a gaze that simulated affection but harbored only relief. I nodded and thanked her, letting her savor the illusion of her triumph while the tailor adjusted the silk around my waist. The fitting concluded, and I walked out onto the cobblestone street. The humid Virginia air felt heavy and thick. I opened my purse and retrieved my phone. There was a secure encrypted message waiting for me from Elias Thorne. Elias did not use frantic language or unnecessary capitalization. He communicated in the stark factual syntax of a fiduciary observing a failed breach from a safe distance. The alert notified me that an external routing protocol had attempted to execute a significant capital withdrawal from the targeted legacy account. The bank compliance algorithms had automatically flagged the request. The origin account held a balance of 0. Elias explained the mechanics of the failure. The system was generating an insufficient funds code, but the standard reporting delay meant the rejection would not formally bounce back to the initiator for another 48 hours. I stood on the brick sidewalk holding my phone and did the math. 48 hours from that exact moment placed the collision right in the middle of our rehearsal dinner. My father was currently purchasing expensive scotch and celebrating a transfer that was already dead in the water. He was driving his car toward a bridge that no longer existed. I unlocked my vehicle and sat in the driver's seat. The engine remained off. I stared at the historic storefronts and let the reality of my parents' actions wash over my nervous system. The timing was the most cruel variable of their entire scheme. They had not waited for a quiet Tuesday after the honeymoon to present me with their fabricated debts. They had launched their theft while I was literally standing on a pedestal being fitted for a wedding dress. They viewed my marriage merely as a distraction tactic, a noisy parade engineered to keep me looking the other way while they emptied my vault. The sheer callousness of the maneuver stripped away the last protective layer of denial I had been carrying for 28 years. I gripped the steering wheel and allowed the tears to fall. I did not cry for the money because the money was safely secured behind the walls of my blind trust. I cried for the little girl who had spent her entire childhood trying to earn a seat at a table that only valued her as a line item. I mourned the parents I wished I had. I grieved for the mother who would have held my hand in the boutique and cried genuine tears over my veil instead of executing a financial heist via text message. I wept for the father who would have walked me down the aisle with pride instead of calculating the exact second he could liquidate my future to cover his own incompetence. The tears lasted for several minutes. I let the sorrow run its course, allowing the pain to burn through the lingering attachments I held for the Beaumont name. Then the weeping stopped. Grief is a heavy garment, and I was done wearing it. I wiped my face and looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The compliant daughter was gone. The weeping bride ceased to exist. The elite management analyst remained. A cold, unbreakable resolve settled deep into my bones, replacing the sorrow with a surgical clarity. I drove home to the modest apartment I shared with Liam. He was in the kitchen preparing a simple dinner of roasted vegetables and chicken. The apartment smelled of rosemary and olive oil, a scent that grounded me instantly. I walked up behind him and wrapped my arms around his waist, resting my cheek against his back. He turned around and studied my face, noting the faint redness around my eyes. He did not pry or demand an immediate explanation. He simply wrapped me in a quiet, steady embrace, holding me until my breathing slowed to match his own. I stepped back and told him about the message from Elias. I explained the pending wire transfers and the 48-hour delay. I told him my father had attempted to drain the accounts while Victoria watched me try on my dress. Liam's jaw tightened. A flash of protective anger crossed his features, but he quickly subdued it, mirroring my own calm resolve. He understood that responding with rage would only validate their chaotic methods. We sat at our small kitchen table and reviewed the timeline. The Beaumonts had initiated a war using weapons they did not understand against a target they consistently underestimated. My father was marching toward the rehearsal dinner bloated with false confidence, assuming he had saved his failing consulting firm and his sprawling estate. Victoria was preparing to play the role of the generous socialite, buying the admiration of her peers with stolen funds. They had no idea they were walking onto a minefield of their own design. The stage was set for a catastrophic collision between Richard's arrogance and my meticulous preparation. I finished my dinner, washed my plate, and prepared for the rehearsal. I just had to let the clock run out. The rehearsal dinner unfolded at a sprawling antebellum manor in Loudoun County, a property boasting sweeping willow trees and a dark history masked by fresh coats of pristine white paint. It represented everything the Beaumont brand stood for: grandeur built on unstable foundations. I walked through the arched entryway with Liam at my side. He wore a crisp navy suit and carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who knew his own worth. We stepped onto the flagstone patio, where a string quartet played a delicate classical arrangement. Waiters in pressed waistcoats circulated with silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres. The air smelled of magnolia blossoms and aged bourbon. The guest list was a curated roster of Northern Virginia elite. State senators mingled with real estate developers and partners from high-powered consulting firms. It was a masterclass in Old South hypocrisy. Everyone smiled, showing perfectly aligned teeth while calculating the net worth of the person standing next to them. I navigated the courtyard utilizing the skills I honed in corporate boardrooms. I shook hands, offered polite deflections, and maintained a neutral, pleasant expression. Beneath the tailored fabric of my evening gown, my pulse remained slow and steady. I was a management analyst observing a corporate entity celebrate record profits on the exact day its stock price cratered to zero. The dramatic irony was intoxicating. My mother darted between clusters of guests, draped in an emerald silk dress that caught the evening light. Victoria was in her element. She thrived in environments where she could dictate the narrative. She floated from a local magistrate to a prominent venture capitalist, painting a portrait of our flawless family dynamic. I watched her rest a manicured hand over her heart while recounting fictional anecdotes about my childhood. She told a judge that she and I had spent the entire morning laughing over old photographs and drinking tea. In reality, we had not exchanged a single genuine word since the hostel fitting at the bridal boutique. She was weaving a tapestry of maternal devotion to ensure everyone in attendance believed the Beaumont matriarch was universally adored by her offspring. Savannah approached our table holding a flute of vintage champagne. My older sister wore a designer cocktail dress she could not afford. Her entire posture exuded the relaxed confidence of a woman who believed her financial rescue was already processing through the banking system. She leaned in to embrace me, her perfume cloying and heavy in the humid air. She loudly praised the floral arrangements, making sure the surrounding tables heard her perform the role of the supportive sibling. Then she lowered her pitch into a conspiratorial whisper. She mentioned she had just finalized the booking for a private tasting tour through the Tuscan countryside, scheduled for the following month. She told me how vital it was to celebrate fresh starts and new chapters. She was actively planning a lavish European vacation using the capital she assumed our father had successfully siphoned from my legacy account. I looked at her flushed, excited face. I offered her a polite, tight smile. I told her I hoped the trip would provide exactly the kind of reality check she needed. She missed the subtext entirely, raising her glass to toast my impending nuptials before gliding away to corner a wealthy lobbyist. The catering staff poured the final round of champagne, and the string quartet faded into a respectful silence. Richard stood up from his chair at the head of the long banquet table. He tapped a silver spoon against his crystal flute, demanding the attention of the courtyard. My father smoothed the lapels of his custom tuxedo and offered the crowd a magnanimous beam. He began his speech by invoking the legacy of my grandfather William, praising the industrious spirit that established our family name. He seamlessly transitioned into a monologue about stewardship and the heavy responsibility of managing significant wealth. Then Richard turned his gaze toward Liam. My father smiled, the sharp, practiced grin of a predator evaluating prey. He told the gathered crowd that adding a high school history teacher to our lineage was a charming twist of fate. He used a patronizing tone, wrapping deep insults in layers of thick Southern hospitality. He suggested that Liam was incredibly fortunate to be welcomed into a family that understood how to protect and elevate its members. The implication hung heavy in the evening air. Richard was publicly declaring that my fiancé was a charity case, a peasant being lifted out of obscurity by the benevolent aristocracy. I felt a surge of protective heat rise in my throat. I glanced at Liam, expecting to see a flash of humiliation or righteous anger. Instead, he was looking at my father with an expression of mild anthropological curiosity. Liam understood that a man who boasts about his wealth at a rehearsal dinner is usually a man drowning in debt. He reached under the heavy linen tablecloth and found my hand. His fingers intertwined with mine, firm and reassuring. He traced a slow circle against my palm, a silent communication reminding me to let the opposing side exhaust their ammunition. As Richard raised his glass to conclude the toast, offering a final boast about the enduring prosperity of the Beaumont estate, a sharp mechanical buzz interrupted the stillness. The sound emanated from the inner pocket of my father's tuxedo jacket. He paused mid-sentence, slightly annoyed by the disruption. He retrieved his smartphone and glanced at the illuminated screen. From my vantage point, I could not read the text, but I knew exactly what the notification contained. The 48-hour holding period had officially expired. The banking compliance algorithms had processed the automated sweeps Richard initiated 2 days prior while I was standing in the bridal boutique. The alert currently vibrating against his palm was a hard bounce notification. It was the financial institution informing him that the Origin account held insufficient funds. It was the digital confirmation that his wire transfers to the caterer, the state tax authority, and Savannah Phantom Bridge loan had all failed. A competent financial manager would have excused himself immediately to investigate a banking alert of that magnitude. But Richard Beaumont was not competent. He was blinded by ego. He glanced at the notification and assumed it was a routine marketing email or a minor administrative ping. He possessed such a profound belief in his own invincibility that he could not fathom the possibility of failure. He casually pressed the side button, silencing the device and slipping it back into his pocket without opening the secure message. He raised his crystal flute higher, demanding the guests drink to my health and the continued success of our union. I watched him swallow the expensive champagne. The snare had snapped shut on his ankle, and he lacked the awareness to realize he was already bleeding. The sheer poetic justice of the moment was intoxicating. I squeezed Liam's hand under the table, locking the secret between us. We drank our ice water, while the rest of the courtyard sipped their wine, paying homage to an empire that had already crumbled to dust. The evening began to wind down as the dessert plates were cleared, and the older guests started requesting their vehicles from the valet. The sky had turned a deep indigo, bruised with the threat of incoming rain. I stood up from my chair, preparing to gather my belongings and escape the suffocating performance. Victoria materialized at my side. She smelled of white wine and unearned triumph. The matriarch placed a manicured hand gently upon my forearm, gripping the fabric of my sleeve just a fraction too tight. She leaned in close, brushing her cheek against mine in a parody of maternal affection. She lowered her voice so the lingering politicians and consultants could not overhear. She told me the evening had been a spectacular success and that the Beaumont legacy had never looked brighter. Then the true purpose of her approach revealed itself. She whispered that tomorrow morning, before the chaos of the wedding day began, we needed to handle a tiny piece of administrative housekeeping. She instructed me to meet her and my father in their private suite at the country club at 9 o'clock sharp. She claimed they had arranged a quick family meeting with their accountant to finalize the trust paperwork and ensure my financial transition was smooth and elegant. I looked into her eyes. They were bright with predatory anticipation. She believed she was leading a docile lamb into a shearing pen. She thought I was unaware of the empty accounts, the predatory loans, and the fraudulent prenup. I offered her a serene, vacant smile. I nodded slowly, confirming my attendance. I told her I would see her in the morning. I turned away and walked toward the exit, with Liam knowing the collision she had requested was going to shatter her reality into unrecognizable fragments. The morning air carried a damp, suffocating weight as I drove through the wrought iron gates of the Piedmont Country Club. The rehearsal dinner had concluded mere hours prior, yet my parents required my immediate presence by 9 sharp. I parked my vehicle and navigated the manicured brick walkways toward the private executive suites. This specific wing of the club was engineered for discreet negotiations and quiet expulsions. The thick carpet muffled my footsteps, and the heavy oak doors absorbed all sound from the corridors. I reached Suite 7 and grasped the brass handle. I did not knock. I walked into the room ready to audit a failure. The suite mirrored a corporate boardroom draped in oppressive luxury. Dark velvet curtains framed the windows, and oil paintings of fox hunts hung on the walls, projecting an aura of entrenched Southern wealth. My family had orchestrated the seating arrangement to maximize psychological intimidation. Richard sat at the head of a long, polished mahogany table. Victoria occupied the leather chair immediately to his right, forming a united front. Savannah slouched next to our mother, cradling a ceramic coffee cup and staring at her smartphone. At the far end of the table sat a man I recognized from brief tense encounters during my teenage years. Mr. Sterling was a mid-tier accountant who had built a modest career, rubber-stamping my father's reckless ledgers. Sterling possessed a frantic, nervous energy, wiping his brow with a tissue and continually rearranging his pens. He was a pawn, a man kept on the payroll solely because he lacked the spine to question a Beaumont. He did not know the true depth of their insolvency. He only knew he had been summoned to facilitate a transaction. They directed me to a single solitary chair, positioned on the opposite side of the expansive wood surface. The physical distance was intentional. It was designed to make me feel small, isolated, and outnumbered. I took my seat and folded my hands in my lap. The theatrical warmth Victoria had deployed the previous night vanished entirely. The loving matriarch, who had whispered endearments in front of state senators, ceased to exist. Her posture stiffened, and her gaze hardened into something resembling frost. She did not offer me coffee. She did not ask how I was feeling 2 days before my wedding. She looked at me and delivered a decree. She stated that the time for polite delays and bridal distractions had expired. Victoria dropped the illusion of a temporary bridge loan. She discarded the gentle fiction that they only needed a minor favor. She declared that a fair and equitable share of my grandfather's trust needed to be distributed to the family immediately. She claimed my upcoming marriage required me to settle my debts to the household that had housed and fed me. She outlined a rigid mandate demanding capital to cover the estate obligations, to stabilize Richard's failing firm, and to secure Savannah's transition into her next chapter. Her tone was clinical and barren. She was presenting a bill for my childhood, treating my existence as an investment that was finally maturing. Savannah did not even bother to weep this time. The fabricated tears from her townhouse foreclosure pitch were gone. She simply sat there, emanating a toxic sense of entitlement. My older sister had spent her entire life shielded from consequence, and she fully expected my signature to fund her next decade of curated leisure. She tapped her manicured fingernails against the ceramic mug, waiting for the transaction to conclude so she could finalize her European itinerary. She viewed my inheritance as her rightful allowance. Richard took control of the meeting. My father leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany surface. He adopted the cadence of a senior executive, dressing down a subordinate employee who had missed a critical quarterly deadline. He spoke about duty and compliance, lecturing me on the responsibilities of carrying our last name. He reached into his leather briefcase and extracted a thick stack of authorization forms. He slid the paperwork across the table until the pages bumped against my folded hands. The documents were printed on heavy bond stock. The top page featured bold legal text authorizing a permanent, irrevocable transfer of assets from my legacy custodial account into a joint holding fund controlled entirely by him. He placed a silver pen on top of the stack. He did not ask for my cooperation. He ordered me to sign. He instructed me to execute the transfer so they could proceed with the wedding weekend without any further administrative distractions. He spoke to me as if I were a stubborn child holding up a vital corporate merger. I looked at the silver pen resting on the white paper. I felt the familiar rhythm of an elite analyst processing a threat. My parents had cornered me in a private suite surrounded by their allies, expecting my lifelong conditioning to take over. They assumed the pressure of the room, the looming wedding, and the sheer force of their combined authority would break my resolve. They thought I would crumble, reach for the ink, and trade my grandfather's protection for a fleeting moment of their approval. The silence in the suite stretched thick and heavy, pressing against the walls. I did not reach for the pen. I did not raise my voice or shed a single tear. A display of emotion is a currency I refuse to spend on people who view me as a ledger. I kept my breathing even and my posture straight. I lifted my gaze from the authorization forms and looked directly into my father's eyes. I watched the arrogant certainty pooling in his expression. Then I turned my attention to the nervous man sitting at the end of the table. I addressed Mr. Sterling with a polite, steady, and measured tone. I told the accountant that before I authorized the movement of any capital prudence required a basic verification of the assets. I asked Mr. Sterling to log into the banking portal and pull up the current live balance of the Origin Trust account on his laptop screen. I stated that I simply wanted to review the exact figures before applying my signature to a binding legal instrument. The request was standard corporate procedure. It was an inquiry so mundane and logical that denying it would have signaled outright fraud. Richard scoffed, breaking the silence with a sharp, dismissive sound. He rolled his eyes at my request, viewing it as the pathetic stalling tactic of a defeated girl grasping at straws. My father possessed a fatal level of unearned confidence. He remembered the phantom wire transfers he had initiated while I was standing in the bridal boutique. He believed those sweeps were safely pending in the banking system waiting to clear. He had never checked the bounce notifications resting in his encrypted inbox. He felt invincible. Richard offered a smug, patronizing smile and nodded toward the end of the table. He instructed the accountant to humor me and pull up the requested dashboard. He wanted me to see the numbers before he took them. Mr. Sterling adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and turned his attention to the keyboard. The air in the room grew still as his fingers moved across the keys, preparing to reveal a truth that would shatter the Beaumont Empire forever. The morning light filtering through the heavy velvet curtains felt muted and stale. Mr. Sterling adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, pushing them higher on his nose as he hunched over the keyboard. The rhythmic clatter of his typing filled the stagnant air of the country club suite. He navigated to the encrypted financial portal, navigating the high-tier asset management interface that my family utilized to project their illusion of solvency. Richard sat back in his leather chair, crossing his arms and offering a patronizing sigh. My father believed he was indulging a paranoid bride humoring a final pointless delay before claiming his prize. I kept my posture straight, my hands folded, resting in my lap, watching the accountant monitor the loading screen. Sterling paused. His brow furrowed into a deep crease. He tapped the trackpad a few times, initiating a refresh command. He squinted at the monitor, leaning closer, as if the liquid crystal display itself was malfunctioning. A bead of sweat formed at his temple, catching the dim light of the chandelier. He muttered something under his breath about connectivity issues and server latency. He hit the refresh key a third time. The machine hummed, rendering the identical data. Sterling swallowed hard. His hands began to tremble, hovering over the keys. He did not speak a single word. He simply gripped the edges of the laptop and rotated the device, turning the bright display toward the center of the mahogany table so Richard and Victoria could view the dashboard. The screen projected the legacy custodial accounts in stark high definition. Every single ledger, every sub-account, every holding tank that was meant to catch the windfall of my grandfather trust displayed identical figures. $0 and 0 cents. The silence that descended upon the suite was dense and suffocating. It was a vacuum stealing the oxygen straight from their lungs. Richard leaned forward, his eyes tracking across the digital zeros. The arrogant certainty evaporated from his features, replaced by a hollow, bewildered shock. His skin lost its color, fading to a sickly gray. He looked like a man who had stepped onto a stair that did not exist. The patriarch who had spent his morning dictating terms was rendered entirely speechless by a single digit. Victoria reacted differently. Her survival instinct demanded an immediate scapegoat. She slapped her palm against the leather armrest and directed her fury at the trembling accountant. She demanded to know what banking error had occurred, insisting the system had suffered a catastrophic glitch. She ordered Sterling to pick up his phone to call their wealth manager to fix the routing issue and to locate the missing capital immediately. Her voice pitched higher, shedding its cultured southern charm and revealing the raw panic vibrating underneath. I let her flail in the dark for 10 full seconds. I let her experience the sheer unadulterated terror of an empty vault. Then I spoke. My voice carried the flat, measured cadence of a senior analyst presenting a final audit to a disgraced board of directors. The bank did not make an error, I said. The banking infrastructure functioned flawlessly. I moved the capital. Victoria snapped her head toward me, her mouth parting but failing to form a sound. Richard gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white against the dark wood. I kept my tone clinical and detached, delivering the facts without a trace of the grief I had buried the day before. I explained the mechanics of the transition. I detailed how my grandfather William structured his legacy to vest at the exact moment I turned 28. I informed them that prior to my birthday, I had retained an independent fiduciary counsel in Richmond. Working alongside that counsel, I established a new blind limited liability company layered beneath an impenetrable, irrevocable trust. The moment the clock struck midnight on my birthday, triggering the vesting parameters, the entire sum bypassed the compromised legacy accounts entirely. A frictionless, automated sweep carried every cent into a secure vehicle that none of them could access, track, or contest. I explained that the zero balance on the monitor was not a glitch, but a successful quarantine of assets. Savannah sat frozen, her ceramic coffee cup hovering an inch above the table. The reality of her canceled European vacation and her impending social humiliation dawned on her face. My older sister, who relied on the endless flow of unearned cash, recognized the well had run permanently dry. Richard struggled to salvage a shred of authority. He stammered, attempting to summon his booming executive voice, claiming I had no right to restructure family resources without consulting him as the senior advisor. He insisted the capital was meant to be managed jointly for the benefit of the estate. He lied, playing the benevolent patriarch, shielding his bruised ego in front of the accountant. I did not argue with his fiction. I reached into my leather tote bag and retrieved the unadorned manila folder. I placed it on the mahogany surface and slid it across the polished wood, stopping exactly in front of my father. I invited him to open it. Richard hesitated, his confidence shattered, but his pride forcing him to look. He flipped the cover open. Inside lay the printed confirmation receipts from Elias Thorne, alongside the banking bounce notifications generated just 48 hours prior. I narrated the contents for the benefit of the room, ensuring Mr. Sterling and Savannah heard every damning detail. I outlined the 3 distinct wire transfers my father had initiated from his terminal while I was standing on a pedestal being fitted for a wedding dress. I listed the specific destinations, the extravagant catering invoice, the state tax authority for his delinquent payroll debts, and the fabricated bridge loan meant to fund Savannah Lifestyle rebrand. I explained that those sweeps had failed spectacularly because they attempted to draw from an origin account I had already emptied. My father had tried to execute a heist and crashed into a concrete wall. I watched the realization dismantle them. I exposed their theft, rendering their high society facade obsolete. The timestamps on the documents proved premeditated financial exploitation, wiping away any remaining illusion of paternal care. Mr. Sterling averted his eyes, grasping the severity of the financial crimes he had been adjacent to. He realized his primary client was not a titan of industry, but a desperate, insolvent fraud. The accountant slowly closed his laptop, seeking to distance himself from the wreckage. Savannah buried her face in her hands, the illusion of her pristine Alexandria life dissolving into the reality of unpaid bills and impending eviction notices. The golden child was finally facing a crisis she could not weep her way out of. Victoria stared at the bounced wire receipts, her chest heaving with shallow, ragged breaths. The elegant Southern matriarch was drowning in the undeniable proof of her own calculating greed. The Beaumont legacy they worshipped was a hollow shell, and the compliant, quiet daughter they had underestimated for 28 years had orchestrated their ruin with surgical precision. They possessed no leverage to compel my cooperation. They lacked the capital to hire litigators to contest my maneuvers. Their sprawling estate in Great Falls faced imminent foreclosure from predatory lenders, and Richard Consulting Firm was days away from public collapse. I sat in the single chair observing the wreckage I had engineered. I felt no guilt. I felt the crisp, clean atmosphere of accountability filling the room. My parents had treated my future as a spreadsheet they could manipulate, and I had simply closed the ledger. The silence returned to the suite, heavier and more profound than before. The trap had sprung, and there was no escape. The shock holding the room hostage fractured the moment Victoria processed the undeniable reality of her ruin. The pristine Southern matriarch, who had spent 3 decades curating an aesthetic of effortless grace, dissolved into something feral and unrecognizable. Victoria slammed her hands flat against the mahogany table. The sudden impact rattled the ceramic coffee cups. Her carefully styled hair shifted out of place. She glared at me with an intensity that burned through the remaining pretenses of maternal affection. The honeyed drawl she utilized to charm local politicians evaporated entirely. Her voice climbed into a shrill, piercing register that echoed off the velvet curtains. She screamed that I was an ungrateful traitor. She accused me of destroying the Beaumont name deliberately, orchestrating a public humiliation to punish the people who gave me life. She listed the expenses of my childhood, treating every meal and every article of clothing as a debt I had just defaulted on. She paced behind her leather chair, waving her hands and outlining the catastrophic social fallout awaiting her. The caterers would walk out. The florist would withhold the centerpieces. The influential guests arriving for the ceremony would witness a bankrupt family unable to settle their invoices. She prioritized the optics of the disaster over the betrayal she had committed to cause it. Victoria was grieving the death of her social currency. I sat still and observed the breakdown. My mother had always operated under the assumption that volume equated to power. She believed that if she yelled loud enough, the world would rearrange itself to accommodate her demands. A management analyst knows that volume is merely the byproduct of a failing system. When an engine lacks oil, the metal components grind together and produce a deafening screech before seizing entirely. Victoria was seizing. I offered no defense to her accusations. Defending yourself against a narcissist only provides them with fresh ammunition. I simply watched her exhaust her vocabulary of insults. When Victoria paused to catch her breath, Richard seized the opportunity to reclaim his fractured authority. My father had spent his entire adult life evading consequences by deploying expensive attorneys to intimidate his creditors. He believed the legal system was a weapon reserved exclusively for men who wore custom suits and possessed country club memberships. He puffed out his chest, straightening his posture in a futile attempt to project dominance. He pointed a trembling finger across the table. Richard declared he would drag me into civil court. He blustered about filing an injunction to freeze my new holding company. He promised to retain the most ruthless litigators in Virginia, claiming they would dismantle the blind trust Elias Thorne had constructed. He threatened to tie up my inheritance in endless litigation until I begged for a settlement. He spoke with the desperate bravado of a cornered animal, hoping the sheer threat of a courtroom battle would force me to capitulate and sign the original authorization forms. I allowed him to finish his tirade. Then I dismantled his legal strategy with a few precise sentences. I maintained my flat professional tone, refusing to match his escalating panic. I informed my father that initiating a lawsuit triggers the discovery process. I quoted the exact statutes Elias had prepared for this specific confrontation. I explained that if he filed a petition, a judge would require a comprehensive audit of all related financial behaviors. I pointed to the manila folder resting on the table. I reminded him that the discovery phase would compel him to submit his encrypted terminal logs into the public record. The court would examine the timestamps of his wire transfers. A judge would see that he attempted to siphon 6 figures out of a custodial account using unauthorized routing protocols. I clarified the legal definition of wire fraud. I detailed the federal penalties associated with attempting to misappropriate trust funds across state lines to cover delinquent payroll taxes. I told him that suing me would simply provide the prosecution with a meticulously documented confession. The color that had briefly returned to Richard's face vanished once again. His arm dropped slowly to his side. The bluster drained out of him, leaving behind a hollow, tired old man. He understood the trap. He recognized that the very documents he needed to contest my actions were the same documents that would send him to a federal penitentiary. Elias Thorne had not merely built a shield. He had wired the perimeter with legal tripwires. Richard was paralyzed. The realization of their checkmate rippled down the table and finally struck Savannah. My older sister possessed zero coping mechanisms for genuine adversity. Her entire existence had been subsidized by the fraudulent wealth our parents maintained. Savannah looked at the bounced wire receipts and comprehended the terrifying truth. No magical bridge loan was coming to save her townhouse. The Alexandria property would plunge into foreclosure. The luxury dealership would repossess her imported vehicle. The carefully curated European retreat was officially canceled. Savannah burst into tears. These were not the theatrical, delicate sobs she utilized to manipulate Victoria. This was a guttural, ugly weeping. Her shoulders heaved as she mourned the sudden, abrupt termination of her prolonged adolescence. She buried her face in her arms, crying over the designer handbags she could no longer purchase and the elite brunch invitations she would soon lose. Her grief was entirely self-centered, an unfiltered display of panic from a woman who had never learned how to survive on her own merit. The country club suite descended into a chaotic symphony of ruin. Victoria hyperventilated near the window, grasping the heavy drapes for support. Richard stared blankly at the mahogany grain defeated by his own paper trail. Savannah sobbed into her sleeves. The noise was overwhelming, a concentrated burst of desperate, frantic energy. I placed my hands on the armrests and stood up from the solitary chair. I smoothed the wrinkles from my trousers, projecting a calm, meticulous composure. The room quieted marginally as they registered my movement. I looked at the 3 individuals who shared my DNA, but possessed none of my loyalty. I delivered my closing statement, ensuring every word landed with the heavy finality of a closing gavel. I told them they had made a fatal miscalculation. I explained that they had priced my worth at a specific dollar amount, viewing my future as a liquid asset they could drain to subsidize their vanity. I stated that when you treat a family member like a corporate liability, you must accept the consequences when that family member learns how to audit a ledger. I reminded them that they had spent decades teaching me the value of ruthless efficiency, and I had simply applied their lesson to my own survival. I picked up my leather tote bag and secured the strap over my shoulder. I looked at Victoria, whose tear-streaked face twisted in a mixture of hatred and profound regret. I informed her that she no longer needed to worry about paying the exorbitant catering invoices or entertaining the state senators. I officially revoked their invitations. I told them my wedding was a celebration for people who valued the bride more than the buffet. I instructed them not to attend the ceremony, warning that security would turn them away at the botanical garden gates. I turned my back on the room and walked toward the heavy oak doors. My spine remained perfectly straight. I did not rush my exit. I opened the door and stepped out into the quiet, muffled hallway, leaving the suite behind. As the heavy wood swung shut, the latch clicked into place, severing the chaotic noise of their panic. I walked down the corridor surrounded by a deep, breathable silence. The contrast was exquisite. They were locked inside a prison constructed from their own deceit, while I walked out into the morning air, holding the documented victory of my total independence. The war was over, and the horizon finally belonged to me alone. 2 days after the collision in the country club suite, I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the bedroom window of my apartment. It was the morning of my wedding. For months, my mother had warned me that precipitation on a bridal day was a catastrophic omen, a sure sign of ruined photographs and muddy hemlines. Victoria viewed the weather as just another subordinate entity she was supposed to control and manipulate. I lay in bed listening to the steady, rhythmic drumming of the drops against the glass and felt only a profound, breathable peace. The air in the room was remarkably light, absent of the suffocating pressure that had defined my entire engagement. I did not have to navigate a frantic schedule of high-end hairstylists, demanding makeup artists, and overbearing socialites. I simply threw off the covers, got out of bed, made a pot of strong, dark coffee, and prepared to marry the man I loved. The rain cleared by early afternoon, leaving the historic botanical gardens washed clean and vibrant green, smelling of wet earth and blooming jasmine. The ceremony took place under a sprawling canopy of ancient oak trees. The opulent Gala Victoria had attempted to construct the 12-piece brass band, the rare imported orchids, the towering raw bar. None of it materialized. The elite caterers and luxury vendors, having received the hard bounce notifications from my father and his fraudulent wire transfers, canceled their contracts immediately. Liam and I replaced the extravagant spectacle with a local acoustic guitarist and a modest, joyful reception at a nearby historic tavern. It was exactly the wedding we had originally wanted before the Beaumont brand hijacked our plans. The guest list was small, comprised solely of colleagues, close friends, and Liam and his extended relatives. The absence of the Beaumont family was noticeable. A few of the guests cast curious glances toward the empty front row, whispering discreetly behind their printed programs. Their whispers did not bother me in the slightest. The empty chairs were not a symbol of abandonment or loss. They were a perimeter fence. When the music started, I did not wait for a father to offer his arm. I smoothed the delicate fabric of my austere ivory dress, squared my shoulders, and walked myself down the aisle. The gravel crunched under my heels. I looked ahead and saw Liam standing at the altar, his eyes steady and warm. We spoke our vows without the shadow of a ledger hanging over our heads. The narrative of the Beaumont Empire unraveled with astonishing speed over the next 3 months. When you build a fortress out of playing cards, a single gust of wind is fatal. My refusal to sign the authorization forms combined with the bounced wire transfers served as that wind. Richard and his consulting firm collapsed within 6 weeks. The state tax authority, possessing zero patience for his bluster, froze the remaining business accounts and filed formal charges for the delinquent payroll taxes. The illusion of his corporate dominance shattered, exposing him as a desperate man running a hollow shell. His prominent clients severed their contracts overnight, desperate to distance themselves from the impending scandal. Richard was forced to shutter. The office lay off his remaining staff and file for Chapter 7, bankruptcy. The local business journals published brief clinical articles detailing the liquidation. I read them over my morning coffee, feeling the cold satisfaction of an auditor closing a compromised file. Victoria suffered a fate she considered far worse than financial ruin. She lost her audience. The predatory lender holding the second mortgage on the Great Falls estate initiated foreclosure proceedings with ruthless efficiency. The sprawling manor with its white columns and manicured boxwoods went to auction. Victoria was forced to pack her designer wardrobes and downsize to a generic two-bedroom condominium in a nondescript development miles away from her coveted zip code. The Piedmont Country Club quietly revoked their membership, citing unpaid dues and a violation of community standing. The elite socialites, the state senators and the venture capitalists she had boasted to at the bridal luncheon, stopped returning her phone calls. The high society grid is purely transactional, and Victoria had lost her currency. She became a cautionary tale whispered about over expensive brunches she could no longer attend. Savannah faced the harshest reality check of all. The luxury dealership repossessed her imported vehicle directly from the driveway of her Alexandria townhouse, a public spectacle that horrified her status-obsessed neighbors. With Richard and his checkbook permanently closed, the townhouse itself soon followed. The bank seized the property, forcing my older sister to abandon her exposed brick walls, her stainless steel appliances, and her carefully curated equestrian aesthetic. Stripped of her monthly allowance, Savannah was thrust into the unforgiving reality of the workforce. The woman who previously required a cold compress to endure the lighting at a bridal fitting was forced to secure a generic entry-level position at a regional insurance agency. She spent her days sitting in a beige cubicle, answering angry phone calls and filing mundane claims, trading her silk dresses for synthetic blouses and sensible shoes. The European rebranding tour became a digital ghost, a deleted itinerary representing the life she believed she was owed but lacked the basic competence to earn. They attempted to breach my perimeter several times during that initial fallout. Sitting at the kitchen island of the modest single-family home Liam and I had purchased, I opened the blocked call log on my smartphone. The screen displayed a list of intercepted voicemails left by my mother. I did not need to play the audio to know the script. The transcripts generated by my carrier revealed the fluctuating waves of her desperation. The early messages were laced with venom and rage, accusing me of orchestrating their downfall and demanding I release the trust funds to halt the foreclosure. When the rage failed to produce a response, the tone shifted into theatrical begging. The later transcripts featured words like forgiveness, family unity, and fresh starts. She attempted to summon the dutiful, compliant daughter, assuming enough guilt would eventually crack my defenses. I highlighted the entire list of messages. I pressed the delete icon. The screen flashed, clearing the log and leaving a pristine, empty interface. I did not listen to a single second of her voice. An elite analyst knows that engaging with a neutralized liability only invites new risk. I locked the device and set it face down on the granite counter. Liam walked into the kitchen carrying a stack of mail and a fresh legal pad. He dropped the envelopes onto the counter and took the stool next to mine. His sleeves were rolled up, carrying the faint, familiar trace of chalk dust from his classroom. He reached across the island and pulled my laptop toward us. We were not reviewing multi-million-dollar trust structures or complex corporate tax evasion schemes. We were reviewing a real, honest household budget. We calculated our mortgage payments, factored in our combined salaries, and set aside a modest sum for our savings account. The numbers on the screen were not large, but they were clean. They were rooted in actual labor and mutual respect, rather than leverage and deception. There were no hidden clauses, no predatory interest rates, and no emotional extortion disguised as a bridge loan. We were building a foundation on bedrock. I rested my head against Liam's shoulder, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the gentle rustle of the trees outside our window. The contrast between my past and my present was profound. For 28 years, I had inhabited a world where love was treated as a transaction and loyalty was measured by financial compliance. I had survived by learning to read the fine print and anticipate the betrayal of the people who were supposed to protect me. But looking at the simple balance spreadsheet in front of me, I realized the most valuable lesson my grandfather had imparted. He did not just leave me capital. He left me the tools to recognize my own worth. I address the quiet women listening to this who are still trying to earn their place at a table that will never feed them. Family is not the people who look at you and see a balance sheet. It is the people who sit with you when the balance is zero and help you build the door. I reached forward and clicked the mouse. I closed the ledger. The laptop screen went dark, reflecting our quiet kitchen back at us, and I finally enjoyed the quiet I had earned.
We spend decades constructing the physical structures of our lives. We build careers, we curate our homes, and we meticulously craft the public images we present to our neighbors. In American culture, especially within the affluent suburbs, there exists a profound and unspoken pressure to maintain a flawless facade. The Beaumont family appeared to have it all: the pristine Virginia estate, the country club memberships, the lineage, and the designer wardrobes. Yet their story did not end with a joyous celebration. It ended in a silent, devastating collapse inside a private suite. The ashes of their legacy leave us with a quiet space to reflect on what it truly means to raise a family, to guide a child, and to build a home capable of withstanding the harsh storms of reality. Before we delve into the heart of these lessons, if you find yourself reflecting on your own family dynamics through these narratives, take a moment to subscribe and follow Still Drama Stories. We explore the quiet victories, the hidden struggles, and the hard truths of human relationships, and we would be honored to have you join our community. When we look past the high-stakes financial maneuvering of Cordelia's survival, we find a profound cautionary tale about parenting. The first and most glaring crack in the Beaumont Foundation was their reliance on the illusion of wealth. Richard and Victoria treated the truth like a dangerous liability. They hid their second mortgages, their mounting debts, and their failing business behind imported orchids and charity galas. Many well-intentioned parents fall into a similar trap, shielding their children from financial realities in an attempt to provide a perfect childhood, or worse, to preserve their own fragile egos. But a family cannot stand on a foundation of whispers and hidden ledgers. When parents lie about their struggles, they deny their children the opportunity to learn resilience. True protection is not a fabricated life of luxury. It is unvarnished honesty. A healthy family sits together at the kitchen table and speaks openly about budgets, limitations, and the inherent value of hard work. By hiding their ruin, Cordelia's parents did not protect her. Instead, they attempted to turn her into a human shield to absorb the impact of their own reckless choices. They taught her that appearances mattered more than substance, a lesson she thankfully rejected. Then there is the tragedy of the golden child. Savannah was handed everything. Her credit card debts were routinely erased, her luxury leases were subsidized, and her manufactured crises were rewarded with instant bailouts. It is a natural parental instinct to want to smooth the path for our children, to grant them the ease we perhaps never experienced ourselves. But removing every friction point is an act of subtle cruelty. Because Savannah was never allowed to face the natural consequences of her actions, she never developed the emotional muscles required to survive adulthood. When the money vanished, she was left utterly defenseless, weeping over a canceled European vacation, while her world burned to the ground. Cordelia, cast aside and valued only for her utility, was pushed to the margins and forced to rely on her own competence. The stark contrast between the two sisters redefines the very concept of fairness in a family. Fairness in parenting does not mean dividing your wealth equally. It means dividing the responsibility equally. True love requires allowing your child to carry the weight of their own decisions. It is equipping them with the strength to navigate the wind, rather than keeping them tethered inside a gilded cage where they can never learn to fly. We must also consider the profound wisdom of Grandfather William, the silent architect of Cordelia's salvation. He bypassed his own son because he recognized the rot, but he did not simply hand a massive fortune to a 14-year-old girl. He attached a timeline. He locked the trust until Cordelia reached the age of 28. This was not an act of control. It was a masterstroke of long-term guidance. He gave her time to witness the flaws in her environment, time to cultivate her own analytical mind, and time to understand the true nature of the people raising her. He left her with a simple, enduring directive: protect what you build. Parenting in its highest and most noble form requires this exact kind of strategic retreat. Our primary job is to provide the tools, instill a moral compass, and then step back. It is recognizing that our children are not our retirement plans, nor are they extensions of our own unfulfilled ambitions. They are independent entities navigating their own course. A parent's ultimate goal should be their own obsolescence, raising an adult so capable that they no longer need you to survive, but choose to keep you in their lives out of genuine affection. Finally, the Beaumont narrative forces us to examine the dangerous weaponization of traditional family values. Victoria and Richard frequently invoked phrases like family honor legacy and loyalty to manipulate their youngest daughter. They demanded blind submission, framing financial exploitation as a sacred duty. In many households, tradition is used as a chain to keep members bound to toxic cycles. But genuine loyalty is never coerced. A healthy family culture respects boundaries. It recognizes that saying no to a manipulative demand is sometimes the most profound act of self-preservation a person can make. The real measure of family is not found in grand performative gestures at a country club or in the hollow boasting of a rehearsal dinner toast. It is found in the quiet, unglamorous moments of genuine care. It is found in a partner like Liam kneeling on a hardwood floor, tightening the screws on a loose door hinge to keep the drafts out. He built more security in that single afternoon than the Beaumonts managed in 3 decades of frantic social climbing. The quiet that settles over Cordelia's life at the end of her ordeal is the reward for her clarity. She closed the ledger on a family that only valued her for her utility, choosing instead to build a life where love is never treated as a transaction. As you look around your own home, listening to the hum of the refrigerator or the faint sound of footsteps in the hallway, ask yourself what kind of legacy you are constructing. Are you building a fragile facade designed to impress the neighbors? Or are you laying bricks of honesty, accountability, and unconditional respect? The ledgers we keep with our children are rarely financial. They are emotional, written in the daily interactions and the unspoken truths we share. One day, those accounts will be balanced. The question remains when your children finally audit the history of your home. What will they find waiting for them in the quiet?